The night of the 11th of February, 2012, inside the luxurious Beverly Hilton Hotel in Los Angeles, the world lost a voice that once seemed untouchable. Whitney Houston, the woman whose soaring notes had defined an entire generation, was found lifeless in her hotel bathtub, surrounded by traces of prescription drugs and the weight of years of inner battles. She was just 48 years old. The news sent shockwaves across the globe, silencing millions who had once stood in awe of her angelic power. For decades, Whitney had been the golden girl of music, selling over 200 million records worldwide and earning the title The Voice. Her rendition of I Will Always Love You became one of the best-selling singles of all time, turning her into a universal icon. To the world, she was radiant, a glamorous superstar, a diva whose voice could lift souls and bring stadiums to tears. But beneath the spotlight, her life was marked by turmoil, scandal, and demons she could never fully silence. The paradox is haunting. How could the woman who embodied perfection on stage, grace, power, and purity be consumed by chaos when the curtain fell? How could the daughter of a gospel singer, nurtured in the sacred hymns of church choirs, end up trapped in a cycle of addiction, heartbreak, and despair? Her death in the bathtub was not just a tragedy. It was the final chapter of a story written in contradictions. A life that soared higher than almost any singer before her, yet ended in one of the most devastating declines in music history. To understand how the angelic voice of Whitney Houston transformed into a cautionary tale, we must journey back to where it all began. A little girl in Newark, New Jersey, blessed with a gift that the world would one day call divine. Whitney Elizabeth Houston was born on the 9th of August, 1963, in Newark, New Jersey, a city buzzing with gospel choirs, soul clubs, and the rhythms of Black America in the 1962nd. Her father, John Houston, worked for the city as an administrator, while her mother, Sissy Houston, was a gospel singer with a powerful voice of her own. Music was not just entertainment in the Houston household. It was a calling, a way of life. But Whitney's childhood was far from a fairy tale. Newark was a city scarred by poverty and racial tension. In 1967, when Whitney was just 4 years old, riots erupted in the streets, leaving her community in flames and fear. The Houstons moved to East Orange, but the memory of a city on fire left its imprint on the young girl who would one day set the world ablaze with her voice. At home, she was surrounded by legends. Her mother, Sissy, toured with Aretha Franklin and Elvis Presley, while her cousin Dionne Warwick and godmother Aretha herself became household names. It seemed destiny had chosen Whitney from birth, yet destiny often comes with unbearable pressure. From an early age, she was expected not just to sing, but to excel. Whitney's earliest performances were not in recording studios or grand stages, but in the modest walls of New Hope Baptist Church. There, her small frame carried a voice far beyond her years, powerful, crystalline, and hauntingly pure. Parishioners remembered the little girl whose hymns could move grown men to tears. By age 11, she was already a soloist in the junior gospel choir, drawing comparisons to her mother and cousins. But behind the applause were cracks that would widen over time. Her father's ambitions often conflicted with her mother's strict discipline, creating a household of tension. Friends later revealed that Whitney craved approval, carrying a quiet insecurity that contrasted sharply with her commanding voice. She grew up with beauty and talent that made her a natural star. Yet even as a child, she seemed to sense the cost of being extraordinary. There were whispers of pain, two stories that would only surface years later about traumas hidden in her childhood. Though unconfirmed at the time, they added to the complexity of a girl who was both blessed and burdened by her environment. By her teenage years, Whitney was already modeling for magazines like 17, the first Black woman to grace its cover, while still singing backup for her mother's performances. She stood at the intersection of two worlds, fashion and music, church and stardom, innocence and exposure. And though the spotlight had begun to shine, its glare would prove both dazzling and dangerous. From the pews of New Hope Baptist to the covers of national magazines, Whitney Houston was on the path to greatness. Yet, as every star must endure, the climb toward fame would bring struggles that could either forge her legacy or fracture her spirit. Whitney's teenage years unfolded like a prophecy. By the late 1972nd, she was singing backup for her mother in nightclubs across New York City, often too young to be legally admitted. Her voice, already polished and commanding, turned heads wherever she performed. Yet for every compliment, there were warnings. She was told she was too pretty to be taken seriously, or that her sound was too polished for the gritty R&B scene. The praise came with an undertone of doubt, the kind that could chip away at a young artist's confidence. As a model, Whitney's face appeared in magazines, her elegance earning her recognition beyond the music industry. She had the looks of a star, but in an era when music labels pigeonholed artists by race, her versatility was seen as a liability. Some executives questioned, was she black enough for R&B or too black for pop? The tension between identity and expectation followed her like a shadow. Her big break came in 1983, when legendary music executive Clive Davis saw her perform at a Manhattan nightclub. It was not just her voice, it was her presence, her command of the stage, that convinced him she was destined for greatness. Davis signed her to Arista Records, believing she had the power to transcend genres and reach audiences across the globe. But even then, the industry doubted. Critics argued that Davis was trying to mold Whitney into a crossover act at the expense of her roots. The release of her debut album in 1985 silenced those doubts. Whitney Houston introduced the world to a voice that was at once angelic and unshakable. Singles like Saving All My Love for You and How Will I Know climbed the charts, showcasing a talent so undeniable that even skeptics fell silent. Yet behind the success was an undercurrent of pressure. Whitney was being asked to carry the weight of representation, to be a pop princess for the mainstream, while still proving herself authentic to her community. Despite the criticism, the triumphs stacked up quickly. She won her first Grammy for Saving All My Love for You, and her name became synonymous with vocal perfection. But not everyone celebrated. Some in the black community accused her of being too polished, booing her at the Soul Train Awards for supposedly abandoning R&B for pop stardom. Whitney wept backstage, shaken by the rejection from the very community she thought she represented. The world was embracing Whitney Houston, but Whitney herself was caught between two identities, the woman the industry wanted her to be and the woman she longed to remain. This tension, planted early in her rise, would never fully disappear. Still, she pressed on. With a voice that could outshine doubt and a drive fueled by both insecurity and ambition, Whitney was about to step into the stratosphere of fame. The release of her second album, and the global phenomenon that followed, would take her from a rising star to the greatest voice of her generation. By the late 1982nd, Whitney Houston was no longer just a rising star, she was a cultural force. Her second album, Whitney, 1987, made history. It debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, a first for a female artist, and delivered an unprecedented string of 7 consecutive #1 singles. Songs like I Wanna Dance with Somebody and Didn't We Almost Have It All became global anthems, cementing her reputation as a voice without rival. Her music crossed borders, languages, and races, uniting audiences in a way few artists ever had. She became the first woman to headline a stadium tour, filling arenas with fans who came not just to hear a singer, but to witness a phenomenon. Every note seemed flawless, every performance a testament to her otherworldly gift. By the time the 1992nd began, Whitney was more than a singer. She was the standard by which all vocalists would be judged. Yet it was 1992 that marked her greatest triumph and the beginning of the contradictions that defined her career. That year, she made her film debut in The Bodyguard alongside Kevin Costner. Critics doubted her acting ability, dismissing her casting as a stunt, but when she opened her mouth to sing Dolly Parton's I Will Always Love You, the world stopped. Her version shattered records, becoming the best-selling single by a female artist in history. The soundtrack sold over 45 million copies, and Whitney Houston was elevated from superstar to legend. The song was more than just a hit, it was an anthem, a cultural touchstone. Her powerful delivery, rising from a whisper to an overwhelming crescendo, embodied both tenderness and strength. It became the defining ballad of the decade, and an eternal reminder of her extraordinary gift. With The Bodyguard, Whitney conquered not only the music industry but Hollywood itself, an achievement few singers had ever managed. And then, in 1991, She had already given the world another moment that would never be forgotten: her rendition of the U.S. national anthem at the Super Bowl. Dressed simply in a white tracksuit, Whitney delivered the Star-Spangled Banner with such majesty that it transcended sport and patriotism. Released as a single, it went platinum, a rare feat for a national anthem. That performance remains etched in history as one of the greatest live vocal displays ever recorded. At her peak, Whitney was everywhere: on the radio, on magazine covers, in films, on world tours. She became an icon of glamour, her image synonymous with elegance and power. To millions, she was untouchable, almost divine. Yet behind the perfection was a woman under immense pressure: the demand to maintain flawlessness, the scrutiny of tabloids, and the strains of a turbulent marriage to R&B singer Bobby Brown. While the world saw a goddess, Whitney was beginning to feel the weight of mortality. Her breakthrough had carried her to the summit of fame, but from that height, every stumble would be magnified. The stage was set for the next chapter one, where the dark side of success would begin to consume the angelic voice the world had adored. The higher Whitney Houston climbed, the darker the shadows that followed her. By the mid-1992nd, the cracks were beginning to show. Her whirlwind marriage to Bobby Brown in 1992, hailed at first as a love story between two stars, soon spiraled into chaos. What had started with fairy tale glamour descended into public fights, tabloid scandals, and a toxic partnership fueled by jealousy, infidelity, and substance abuse. Behind closed doors, Whitney endured turmoil that contrasted sharply with her immaculate public image. As the pressures of fame mounted, drugs became both her refuge and her prison. Cocaine and marijuana were whispered about in backstage circles, and rumors of erratic behavior grew louder with each year. The woman once celebrated for her flawless discipline began missing rehearsals, canceling shows, and stumbling through interviews. The tabloids feasted on her decline, branding her the fallen diva. The turning point came in 2002, during an infamous interview with Diane Sawyer. Confronted about her drug use, Whitney's defiant response, "Crack is whack," burned into public memory. The denial only deepened the tragedy. As fans watched an idol unravel in real time, her once soaring voice began to falter, scarred by years of abuse. Concerts that should have been triumphs ended in boos from disappointed crowds, but drugs were only part of her torment. There were darker wounds, too. Years later, revelations emerged about her childhood traumas, allegations of abuse at a young age that she had carried silently. The pain she masked with fame and drugs was more than the spotlight alone could explain. Even as her personal life spiraled, Whitney tried to stage comebacks. Albums in the 2002 promised rebirth, but the magic was fading. Her final world tour in 2010 was heartbreaking. Critics wrote of a broken voice, the angelic tone reduced to hoarseness. The woman once untouchable now seemed fragile, mortal, and desperately tired. Tragedy struck again in 2007 when her father, John Houston, passed away amid a bitter lawsuit over money he claimed she owed him. Even in grief, Whitney faced betrayal and conflict. The very family ties that had once nurtured her gift now frayed by fame and fortune. By the time February 2012 arrived, Whitney was attempting yet another return, scheduled to perform at a pre-Grammy party hosted by her mentor, Clive Davis. Instead, the world awoke to the devastating news. Whitney Houston had drowned in her Beverly Hilton hotel bathtub, her body weakened by years of drug use and a cocktail of substances found in her system. The icon who had once seemed larger than life was gone, at just 48. Her death was not just a loss, it was a symbol. It embodied the brutal cost of fame, the price of perfection, and the dangers of demons left unresolved. To millions, Whitney's fall from grace was as shocking as her rise had been inspiring. The angelic voice had been silenced, but its echoes still haunted the world. Yet even in death, Whitney Houston's story was not finished. Because beyond scandal and tragedy, there remained the question of legacy. What she left behind for music, for culture, and for those who still called her the voice. When the music industry gathered on the night of the 2012 Grammy Awards, the air was heavy with grief. Just hours earlier, the body of Whitney Houston had been discovered upstairs in the Beverly Hilton, even as her mentor Clive Davis's annual pre-Grammy gala carried on below. It was a cruel irony. The very stage where Whitney had once ruled the world now mourned her absence. Yet in that moment, as Jennifer Hudson performed a trembling tribute of "I Will Always Love You," it became clear Whitney's voice had not truly died. In the years since her passing, her legacy has only grown. With more than 200 million records sold worldwide, Whitney remains one of the best-selling artists of all time. Her influence echoes in the voices of nearly every major diva who followed Mariah Carey, Celine Dion, Beyoncé, Adele, all of whom cite her as a guiding light. To this day, no talent show or singing competition escapes comparisons to Whitney notes, a benchmark so high that few can ever reach it. Her accolades remain staggering: 6 Grammy Awards, 2 Emmy Awards, 30 Billboard Music Awards, and induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But beyond trophies and numbers, Whitney left behind something more profound, a sound that could pierce the human spirit, carrying joy and sorrow in equal measure. She was called the Voice, not just for her technical perfection, but for her ability to make millions feel as though she was singing directly to them. Even her flaws became part of her story. The struggles with addiction, the turbulence of her personal life, and her tragic end all serve as reminders that behind the glamour stood a woman who carried unbearable weight. Her downfall was painful to witness, but it humanized her, making her legacy one of both greatness and fragility. Today, Whitney Houston is remembered not only as a star, but as a symbol of what happens when unmatched talent collides with the unforgiving pressures of fame. Her songs still fill stadiums, her anthems still soundtrack weddings, heartbreaks, and triumphs across generations. And every time her voice soars through the speakers, whether in the first notes of Greatest Love of All or the shattering climax of I Will Always Love You, the world is reminded that some gifts are too pure to ever fade. Whitney's life was a paradox, an angelic voice trapped in a mortal struggle. But in her death, she became eternal. She remains not only a cautionary tale, but also an immortal reminder of music's power to touch the soul. The diva, the icon, the voice, Whitney Houston still sings and always will.